Welcome back to Choo. My name is Jacob, and today, ladies and gentlemen, NBs and others, I am going to do pretty much a crash course into mead. What is mead? The history of mead, the different varieties, how to make mead with precise measurements, so stay tuned for that if you want to make mead from home, which will include the fermentation, racking it, i.e. moving it from one container to another to sort of clarify and clear it up and all that kind of shit, bottling it, aging it, etc, etc. Now, we'll put a small disclaimer out there. I am an amateur at best. I've been making mead for about 3 years. I've been brewing on and off for like 10 years or 20 years even as a kid. I used to sneak stuff in under my parents didn't know about. Using bread yeast, which is horrible, but we won't go into too much detail about that. In fact, I might even cut this whole bit. I would say, you know what, let's go one step lower. I would say I am an enthusiast at best. But today I'm just going to share with you what I've learned over the last 3 years of mead making. I've been drinking this shit forever. It's my favorite alcoholic beverage. It is the nectar of the gods. And I'm just in love with it. So I'm just going to share my passion with you guys with a whole bunch of other resources. So if you fucking don't like what I'm doing, I will share some links to other YouTubers who are much better than me, professional YouTubers. But this is just a crash course into mead. So let's get started. So what exactly is mead? I'll tell you. So mead is essentially simply honey wine. Wine made from fermenting honey. So just a quick refresher on how alcohol works, how fermentation works. Basically, yeast eats sugar and then poops out alcohol. So yeast converts sugar into booze. So as long as your primary sugar source is honey, you essentially have a mead. And there's lots of different varieties of meads. You've got melomels, which is when you add fruit, and then there's lots of different types of melomels as well. So if you were to add cherries to it, you would get the notorious Viking blood. If you had to add chilies or peppers, as the Yanks say, you would have capsaicin, I can never pronounce that word. If you add spices to it, you got spice mead, etc. As long as 51%, I guess that's the rule, 51% or more of your sugar comes from honey, then technically it's a mead. So a traditional mead is just honey, water, and yeast. Maybe you'll add some yeast nutrient to it. We'll talk about that later. And then you've got a myriad array of variations. You can make your own stuff up. You can make poo mead if you wanted. You can just call it peed. I don't know if you'd ever want to drink that. I mean, sometimes you run out of booze, the shops are closed, bust out the poo mead. I'm not really sure why you'd make that in the first place. What the fuck am I talking about? All alcohol starts with fermentation. So from mead to beer, ales, lagers, whatever, pilsners, IPAs, XPAs, these all start with a fermentation process. Wine, red wine, Shiraz or Chardonnay, white wine, all of these things start with fermentation. Even hard liquor, before it's distilled, which is another process entirely, it starts with fermentation. Every single booze you drink starts with fermentation. And then we twist it, we manipulate it, we add different yeast, we add different things to it, might add hops to it, might add this, we might add that, and then we get all these different types of alcohol. But essentially, everything starts with the fermentation process. Mead is simply fermented honey water. That's essentially what mead is. But where did it come from? What is the history of mead? Well, this is really fun because one of the main reasons I love mead is because it's considered, evidently, the oldest alcoholic beverage known to humankind. In other words, people were getting fucked up off mead long before beer, definitely before anything distilled like spirits, whiskey, rum, whatever, long before people were crushing grapes. Probably because honey was one of the earliest sugar sources that we could get, probably before barley or wherever fucking sugar comes from, sugarcane, whatever. Maybe people were eating fermented fruit, but as far as we know, archaeologically and even scholarly, like there's references that are a couple thousand years old that explain how mead is made in Soma or in the pyramids or whatever. But we have archaeological evidence, and recently they found chemical evidence of mead, the evidence of mead, honey, and I think they had rice particles in there, in ruins in China. You're talking 11,000 years ago. This is the dawn of the Neolithic era. This is roughly the same time people stopped becoming hunter-gatherers and became more settled, i.e. villages and towns started to emerge, chieftains and whatnot. People weren't walking around all day looking for food. People started to settle, thus they had time to ferment. And this is roughly around the same time where bread started. So we don't really know the exact origin of mead, but honey existed all over the world, unlike certain plants. So thanks to our friends the bees, probably at different times around the world, people just figured out that they could ferment honey and get fucked up. But also it was used ritualistically, it was used in ceremonies. I mean, years later, you know, the Celts, which is my ancestors, were doing massive feasts and stuff like that, where mead was at the center in a cauldron, like a massive cauldron and so on. So it was also quite a spiritual thing for a lot of people. I guess people didn't really understand what alcohol was doing to them at the time. They start fucking seeing to everything and think that gods are talking to them. They're just drunk. But the oldest archaeological evidence of mead that we have, which has chemical elements in it, so it's 100% guaranteed, we know for a fact that people were intentionally fermenting honey at least 11,000 years ago. So it's the oldest alcoholic beverage known to human, and I think that makes it very special. And it's starting to see a bit of a resurgence. People are starting to get way more into it because of that thing. And it's also amazingly delicious. Nutritious, I guess. But it's also just, it's fun. It's like we humans have had this connection with this drink longer than almost anything other than like water, I guess. But again, like I said, we don't really know how it came across. Probably people discovered it by accident. There's theories that at the time people were making bread, although they probably didn't have an understanding of yeast, so it's very unlikely that people were intentionally adding yeasts to it. There's theories that people would have some sort of like old cloth or some old piece of shit that they just keep adding to the thing, and that would create fermentation because it had yeast in it. They didn't know that the microscopic yeasts or whatever were in there, but they knew that if they added this dirty sock to the thing or whatever beard shit, that it would make booze. There are theories that maybe it was a bread maker, left some bread and some water, whatever, it turned into a thing, but at the time they probably weren't adding yeast to bread. This was around the time people started making bread, but it would have been flatbreads like chapati from India, or what we now call Mexico. They would have had the tortillas. These are crushed seeds, but they probably weren't letting it rise. They're just crushing it and cooking it straight away. There is one more theory, and this is what I like to think happened. And it goes a little something like this.
The dawn of the Neolithic period, a humble beekeeper or forager perhaps left some honeycomb in a pot and simply forgot about it. The rains then came, filling the pot with water, and perhaps some natural yeasts also ended up in the pot, causing accidental fermentation. A few weeks later, along comes a passerby, and when noticing the pot, decides to quench his thirst, and perhaps for the first time in human history, gets totally shit-faced.
Mate, what the bloody hell are you doing? I was just had some drinking water and now I feel good. Mate, you know we got like a bunch of woolly mammoths to kill or something. Fucking love you, man. Well, you can't be... First you should try this water, man. I'm a big fan.
There are a few flaws in that theory, however, because if it was an open container, probably it would oxidize, turning the alcohol into vinegar. Like, you know, when you leave a bottle of wine open, the next day it's a little bit pongy because oxygen fucks up your booze. But like I said, my ancestors, the Celts, would have massive cauldrons in the middle of their feasting tables and, you know, up to 60 liters of booze in the middle of their tables. So, I don't know, maybe it didn't oxidize that fast. I don't know for sure. No one knows until we invent a time machine, and even then, who the fuck would know? But it's fun to fantasize about. Are you supposed to jump off the table? Go! Woo! Anyway, enough chit chat. Let's fucking make some of the stuff. So, this is pretty much everything you need. Obviously, you're going to want honey. You want to get your hands on some yeast. We'll talk about yeast in a bit. You're going to want something to ferment in. I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. You're going to want an airlock or something like this. Something to stir with. Funnels help. Pots are good. Sterilize the shit out of everything. Now, here's something you might want, which is always good fun. There's a hydrometer. We'll talk a little bit about that. That's to pretty much see what sort of alcohol content your booze is going to have, how strong it's going to be. And this is what's called an auto siphon. Super essential. Looks like a penis pump for a really long, thin cock, but you don't need it, but I highly recommend it. And you also probably need it. And you also want to be drinking while doing this.
I'll start by slightly heating the honey to help dissolve it into some water. Make sure the temperature does not go above 35 degrees Celsius, or else you will kill all the subtleties of the honey, and you might as well just use fucking sugar.
Once you've dissolved your honey, it's time to add it into a reciprocal of some kind. Now, you can use a demijohn or a carboy, as the Americans like to say. You can use anything. You can use one of these. I bought this specifically. This is a fruit juice container. Check out my fucking apricot video. You can see how we turn that into booze. These are great. I use this water cooler thing As long as you can seal it with an airlock, it doesn't really matter what you use, again, as long as it's sterilized. As far as yeast is concerned, I'm going 10 grams of yeast per liter of water, but I'll probably throw 10 grams in 20 liters. I just use the packets, just whatever's in the packet. If I'm not doing a huge 40 liter batch, I actually don't have anything that's that big. 10 to 10. As far as sugar is concerned, as far as honey is concerned, for me, I basically go 1/3 honey, so 30% honey, more or less, 70% water, and then adjust the yeast accordingly. I'm sure I'll put all of this shit up on a little thing for you to look at. It does fluctuate a lot. Some people don't want the yeasts to ferment all the way, so they'll add like sulfurs to it and stuff later to sort of kill the yeast in its spot. I just max everything out. Like this yeast here can go up to 18% alcohol. Fuck it. I don't know if I've got enough sugar, but I'll throw it in there, let it max out. The only problem you have to worry about is if you're going to back sweeten and your yeast hasn't reached its potential alcohol yet, you might explode stuff. So you don't want to explode stuff. So just be aware of that. But for a traditional mead, I just like to go honey, water, yeast nutrient if I've got it. I don't have any here. We'll talk about that in a bit. Throw it in your container, let it ferment all the way until it's done, and then I will just bottle it up. I will almost never nuke my yeast, although a lot of mead people and homebrewers and wine people are yelling at me right now. I just let it go all the way. I let it eat all the sugar because I like a really dry mead. If you want a sweeter mead, you let it back sweeten, but even then, once that alcohol content has reached a certain level, the yeast is going to be fucked anyway. It's not going to be able to do anything. But you can add things to it later to stop the yeast in its tracks. I don't bother with that personally. I have done in the past, but right now, I just let everything go. Just let it go, do its thing. That's the easiest way. I got stuff to do, man. I gotta go walk over there and I gotta walk down to the creek and muck around. I don't have time for that shit.
So what I like to do is get my buddy Zach to come over under the guise of having a drink and really just get him to help me with this sort of stuff. So what you need to do first of all is get yourself a Zach, then add the dissolved honey water mix into one of your containers. Then I add my yeast and mix that all around. I would also typically add yeast nutrient in this stage as well, but I ran out and the store had sold out, so I didn't have any, but typically I would add a yeast nutrient. You can just get that from your local homebrew store. With clean water, fill the rest of your container almost to the top, but leave a little bit of headspace because things might expand, you'll end up with a bit of froth and shit on there, and then just have a drink. Reward yourself. Attach an airlock to the top of your container and put a little bit of water in there. What an airlock does is allows for the gas CO2 to escape as your broth ferments without letting oxygen in or bugs or dirt and just nasty little things like that. Airlocks are essential. There's lots of different types you can use. I've got a whole bunch of different ones. Do a bit of research. There's a fair bit of info on there, but you definitely want to make sure you've got an airtight container with an airlock. Otherwise, you will spoil the batch. Put somewhere dark or wrap it up and make sure that you keep the room temperature or the mixed temperature at whatever the yeast's tolerance is. So check the back of your yeast packet. It should have a temperature range on there. As long as your fermenter stays within that temperature range, the yeast will be active and start converting the sugar to alcohol. And then you're done. 3 to 6 weeks later, or depending on the size of your batch, they all take difference. Depends on your yeast, depends on how much sugar, depends on the temperature, depends on how big your batch is. But typically mine take between 3 to 6 weeks. Then it's ready to rack. So let's talk about racking. Racking involves moving your fermented liquid from your original fermented container to another or several other containers. The idea is to leave behind the dregs, which is like dead yeast, and if you've got fruit and things like you've made a melomel and there's all like leftover shit in there, you leave that behind, essentially clearing up your mead. Every time you rack it, you're going to leave behind a little bit of your dregs, and your mead or your wine or whatever is going to get clearer and clearer and clearer. And now there are a few ways to do this. If you have one of these sort of typical fermenters, you'll have a little tap on the bottom. You can just crank that tap. You'd probably want to stick a hose to it because this method is not ideal just pouring it straight in the bucket because you're adding heaps of oxygen. In this particular batch, I'm not so worried because I'm adding extra sugar for a secondary fermentation. Now, with the traditional mead we just made, I'm not going to do a secondary fermentation. I'm not even going to back sweeten it. If you want to know how to do that, leave a comment and, I'll make another video on how to do more complex meads and things like that. So typically you'd want to add a hose to this tap so you don't get all that extra oxygen. A little bit of extra oxygen doesn't hurt if you're going to do a secondary ferment, like I said. But there is a better way to rack. Using that little penis pump looking thing, the auto siphon, is ideal. Basically, this allows you to keep the nozzle off the bottom so you don't stir up all the dormant yeast and all the leftover shit, and it allows you to just get the pump started and then have gravity do the rest. So you just got to pump it a few times and then it will fill up. Also, due to the hose, you won't get heaps of extra oxygen in your batch. So as mentioned, this is the time where you might want to back sweeten if you've killed all your yeast, or if your alcohol's strong enough. You might also want to do a secondary ferment. You might want to add spices and all kinds of different stuff to get a more consistent flavor profile instead of putting it in when you first ferment the primary. This is also the time that you would take a second hydrometer reading to really figure out what your alcohol content is. Now, I didn't really talk about hydrometers that much in this video, mostly because I forgot to take a reading during the thing, but also because there's a billion videos on there already. Just type in how to use a hydrometer. But essentially, right before you add your yeast or right before you seal up your primary fermentation, you take a reading. Then you take a reading once it's done fermenting. With a small calculation, you can get a pretty good estimate of what your alcohol content's going to be. But honestly, I'll put a link in the description to a video explaining it far better than I ever could.
So this is 5 gallons, which is like almost 19 liters. So it's a weird odd number. These are 5-liter containers with a little bit of headspace. So you're probably looking at 4.8 liters in each one of these or something like that. Who knows? So you're always going to end up with a little bit that you don't have a right size container for. Usually you just chuck that out or add it to your next batch or something like that. But typically here we just drink it.
Hey, Zanky boy, you gotta bloody drink. You gotta drink the dregs, man. That's the rules, man. It's free booze.
Free
dude.
booze.
Free booze.
Free booze.
Frues. How much do you want? More?
That's some cloudy booze.
It's Mead. I call it Queed.
It's got way more of an aftertaste. But
Not unlike I've heard.
So once you've racked it, you can rack it again into bottles like this. And as you can see, this is quite clear. It's still a bit murky, but it's clearer than the other stuff because every time you rack it, if you just keep the siphon off the bottom, the yeast is going to settle. You can also cold crash it by putting it in the fridge. Everything will drop to the bottom. So every time you rack, you're going to end up with a little bit of the dregs at the bottom. Now, it's still alcoholic. It still does its job. People keep that. You can add it to the next brew. You can keep the yeast from it, etc., etc., or you can just drink it. I don't recommend doing that though because it's kind of yucky. I mean, you can, whatever, drink responsibly, but but every single time you rack, you're going to get a clearer and clearer mead. In the traditional mead, it's not that hard to get it clear. And honestly, the clarity is purely for aesthetics. It tastes the same most of the time. By the time you get to this stage, it tastes the same. So I wouldn't really worry about it that much. From the buckets, you can then rack exactly the same process into bottles, big bottles, and then from here you can get little bottles. You can seal those as long as you've killed the yeast or stopped the yeast, or the yeast has done its job, or the alcohol is so high that the yeast is inactive. You can pretty much put it in anything, and that's how you make it mead. A lot of people recommend aging it. Once it's done fermenting, i.e. the little bubblers stop going, that's as much alcohol as you're going to get out of it unless you, like I said, secondary ferment. This means it's ready to drink, but it's not ideal. It's not that tasty. Ideally, you want to age it. Aging it, and you want to rack it, and you want to age it. Aging will get rid of the yeasty properties. It will allow some of the subtleties of the honey to come out. So you want to bottle it, chuck it in a cupboard for like 6 months. Then start drinking it, and you're going to get a much nicer, more refined mead. But you don't have to.
So that's pretty much the end of my mead video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hit like, hit subscribe, share this around if you did. If you don't like it, hit dislike, but I'd prefer it if you didn't do that because that'd be shit for me. I've started a homebrew playlist in the playlist sections on the Choo YouTube channel, so stay tuned to that. There's a couple on there already. I'm going to just keep uploading different types of brews, and if you just keep following, you'll learn how to make a whole bunch of different stuff. In the description, there's a whole bunch of resources, other YouTubers. I hope they don't mind me referencing them. I don't know them personally or whatever. I've had some minimal interactions with some of them in the comment section of their videos, but I don't know them, so I hope they don't mind. But anyway, they're really good, so check them out if you want to get much more in-depth videos on how to make good meads, different types of meads and wines and alcohols and etc, etc. Hit like, hit subscribe. If you liked my video, share it around, man. It's the best thing you can do. You could also buy some chili sauce from my chili sauce website that I make chili sauce. I'm a chili sauce man, don't forget. And leave a comment below and let's get a friendly discussion going. If you have any questions, I'll hope to answer them them. I know this was a pretty long video with lots of different shits, hard to cover everything. Booze making is just so varied. There's so many things you can do. There's no way to do it all in one video, but hopefully this crash course helped you understand about mead, a bit of the history, etc, etc. I love you guys very much. Thanks for watching my stuff.
Man, honey lasts forever, dude. They found shit in the pyramids, man, from thousands of years ago.
Yeah.
It was crystallized, but then you just heat it up and it just turned back into honey.
Yeah.
From thousands of years. Oh, dude, sickest story ever. The other day, I just found this article. I don't know how long ago this happened. Very recently though, where they found an old shipwreck with heaps of old beers and brews and rums and shit in there, which are in glass containers that have kept from it's about 100 years old, and they're finding all these yeasts that have since been lost, these yeast strains that are in this old shipwreck, and they're bringing back fucking crazy yeasts and all these different recipes from 100 years ago just because this one boat.
That's amazing.
I'll link it in the article. Is that still recording?
Yeah, it's still recording.
Yes! How fucking sick's that though?